Hadn't thought about that before.
Well, we have time, and also as we wind down, of course, this can be as short as you feel comfortable, but also we'll probably if we go that far at around the 50-minute mark, I'll begin to ask you questions to like sort of summarize stuff. So
Okay.
we'll wrap it up at about 55 minutes or so. Okay, are you good with that?
Sure. Yep.
All right, unless you got to take a dump. All
Not
right.
yet.
All right. So 3, 2, 1. Hey, today we're going to talk with Greg Skaff, a New York City musician. And hi, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Greg,
How's it going there?
I know a lot about you, but I'm sure some others don't. So why don't we start the conversation by giving you some time to maybe introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you, and so on, and so forth. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, like Brian said, I'm a New York City-based guitarist, working guitarist, at least until the pandemic. But I grew up in the Midwest in Kansas, and I moved here in hopes of getting a jazz career. And I've done that, but I've done a lot of other things. I've worked, always just wanted to work as a musician, no matter what the situation. So I've done club dates, I've done R&B gigs, uh, schlepping my equipment around the city for little gigs. Um, but I've managed to get put out 5 CDs of my own under my own name, instrumental CDs, as well as currently holding a chair at the Broadway musical Wicked. So I've done that for 16 years while I'm doing all this other stuff. And I'm still moving. I have a new record. Um, it's going to be released later this year. It's a trio with bassist Ron Carter and drummer Tootie Heath. And that's where I'm at right now, just trying to keep the chops up while we're not digging.
I hear you. Well, thank you. I mean, it sounds like you've had a very full and interesting and varied career thus far. And why don't you take us
I've
back?
been kind of fortunate, but one factor was I always just wanted to work
Right.
as a guitarist. So I would take a lot of other gigs a lot of other people might not take.
For sure. Why don't you bring us back to the early days? How did you get into music way back when? And what were some
So,
of your influences and so on?
so when I was a teenager, hearing the British rock and roll bands, that really captured, my imagination, and I just wanted to be like that and be in a band. And I didn't really understand what it entailed, but I managed to get a guitar. My parents got me a guitar, and I joined a band, and we play around the Midwest, around town in the Midwest, and but I gradually my influences back then, early like that, were people like Jimmy Page, Keith Richards, the guitar players in those bands.
Right.
But I didn't really understand or didn't really think about actually attaining any kind of level of technique on my instrument. I just always wanted to play. I would learn the songs and the parts in the songs, and that was it. And then a few years later,
Did you take lessons or anything, or did you just pick
I
up a
took
guitar?
probably just a couple lessons from a guy. It would be out of a Mel Bay book, and I think I was just confused, and I thought, well, this isn't what I want to learn.
Right.
So I stopped after about 4 lessons, and I would just learn off off records. And I didn't really have any. I didn't really early on. I didn't have any curiosity about becoming a real, a very good musician, really. I just wanted to play in a band and play those parts. I didn't really understand how far you could take it. But a few years later, one of the guys in our band, his father had a record collection of all kinds of jazz. And I remember when I first heard it, there was a Charlie Parker song, and I remember thinking, well, this must be Dixieland because it sounds so happy. I knew nothing about it, but but at the same time, we had all these records by the Chicago blues guys like Magic Sam and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, and we would be learning those songs. And then,
do you feel like I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you feel like the Chicago scene was influential?
Oh yeah,
from your geographical standpoint.
From a what?
I said just because you're from the Midwest, that was the closest.
Well, I never thought of it. Maybe, but I'll tell you another thing. On the radio, there was a lot of regional rock and roll and sort of R&B that I think never really got very popular on the East or West Coast. There was a lot of smaller groups. I can't think to name any of them now, but there were really good players around town where I grew up, Wichita. Really, there was a lot of really good musicians of all sorts. And another kind of pivotal moment was when there was and is a keyboard player named Mike Finnegan who was living in Wichita at the time, and he had a band that.
Hey, Greg, if you can hear me, Greg.
Had a recording contract with Columbia.
Greg, hold on.
He managed.
Greg, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you're freezing. Your audio and your video is freezing. So okay. At the bottom of your screen, if you wouldn't mind, go to where it says stop video.
Okay.
Can you, I want to see if you stop the video, will we get a better audio? Okay. So you were telling us about,
well, there was a pivotal moment where sort of a musical mentor of mine named Mike Finnegan, who's still around, lives in Los Angeles. He was living in my hometown, and he had a band that came to New York. They had a recording contract with Columbia. They were called the Surfs. But while he was here, he was chosen to play on the Jimi Hendrix record, Electric Ladyland.
Oh, wow.
So when he came back to Wichita, he gave me 2 records. There was a George Benson record, and then he gave me a Jimi Hendrix record. And when I heard them, I was just blown away. In fact, when I heard the Hendrix record, I really didn't think it was guitar. I thought it was I didn't understand how you made that sound. But those 2 guitar players, they really inspired me early on, and Mike's mentorship really kind of spurred me to really become a better guitarist and musician.
So can you elaborate on that a little more? So he hipped you to some different music. So I take that, but was he coming to your gigs and giving you feedback?
Well, our band practiced in my mom's basement, either our basement or my family's basement or the drummer's basement. And Mike would come there and come down to the basement and tell us, teach us things. He actually taught me how to tune my guitar.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
And, yeah. And a lot of other things. See, I remember, and at the time, I don't think he could have been more than in his mid-20s, but he was really knowledgeable. He had actually, I forget where he'd gone to school on a basketball scholarship, but then he had moved to Wichita and he already knew a lot. So, I mean, he'd already, when he would mentor us, he had already played on the record Electric Ladyland.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, but he would come and just kind of coach our band. And then our band, we would sneak into the clubs where he was gigging, or else we would stand outside and just listen to the band. And it really made, he really was an influence, made a big impression on me. And that sort of got me to thinking about, well, wow, I wonder if maybe I should move to New York, because that's where it seems like everything is going on. So I kind of set my sights there. And then, and I moved around a little bit. I lived in San Francisco for a little while, for a year, and then but I happened to move to Rochester, New York, upstate.
So when you thought you were moving, so when you wanted to come to New York, what what brought you to Rochester, and why didn't you come to the directly to the city?
Well, it's kind of embarrassing, but I really didn't know much about New York State or New York City. In fact, I thought I was sort of moving close to New York City when I moved to Rochester. But what brought me there was a keyboard player I knew had gotten a gig playing in a jazz R&B, an R&B jazz group, and they needed a guitar player. So he sent for me, and I moved there. I moved there with my girlfriend. We packed up and just drove there from Kansas.
And that group was located in Rochester?
Yeah, they were located in Rochester, but we would travel around and play for, it seems it'll probably, I don't know if those days will ever come back. We would play for weeks at a time in cities like Hartford, Connecticut, Springfield, Massachusetts, Buffalo, Cleveland, Rochester, of course, because that's where we were based.
So is this like in hotels and stuff, like in the lounge? Or
some hotels, but mostly clubs. I mean, just kind of clubs. Yeah, really.
nice,
really
very nice.
cool. There was one hotel in Buffalo that we played at that had a jazz series, but most of those were just club gigs that would have hire a band for 5 nights a week.
Those are definitely days that I guess if you were born after 1980, you will never experience, right, you'll never experience those days. But I'm old enough to remember those days as well. Just there were bands everywhere, right, Craig?
Oh man, yeah, and there were gigs everywhere.
Yeah,
because that's basically how I supported myself most of the time. And then after a year in Rochester, we packed up. My girlfriend and I packed up, and we moved, just sort of cold moved to New York. Just we found there was someone in Rochester who knew someone in New York who was renting a room, and we just moved here. We packed up our stuff in our car and moved here.
Wow.
And it was something I would never do now. I mean, it was just because there was so much I didn't know.
What was it like? What was it like those first days? Did you stay with your friend? Did you look for an apartment? What did you do?
Well, I remember we drove in, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning when we got here, and there was trash blowing around the streets and people walking around.
The old days.
I felt like crying.
Welcome to New York.
Yeah, exactly.
Just as I pictured it.
Yeah, well, yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I remember it felt like crying, and then so we had this room we were staying on the Lower East Side in what now is not too bad a neighborhood, but it was really bad then. I mean, it was it was terrible then. We were on 10th Street between Avenue C and D.
Oh boy.
Yeah, but and I remember I would walk across. I would walk across the East Village to the West Village and just go hang out at the jazz clubs. I don't think I would go in that much because I just didn't have any money. But every night I was out, or I'd take my guitar if I heard about some jam session. And just gradually I met people and found work.
What were some of the clubs that you would go to either for jams or to hear some music, if you can
Oh,
describe it?
to different jams.
Yeah.
I think there wasn't a jam session there, but I would go to hear, I would stand outside of Sweet Basil. It was on 7th Avenue. Or I would stand in the stairwell at the Village Vanguard and listen to the music. Some of the jam sessions, there was a place on 145th and Broadway called the Breezin' Lounge, and it was owned by George Benson and run by his manager. And they had a jam session. And I remember I got to play one night with some guys that I thought were just the neighborhood guys. They were so good. I remember I went home and I told my girlfriend, I said, I can't make it here. Just like I thought they were just neighborhood guys, but it was Marcus Miller and a keyboard player named Bernard Wright playing piano. But I didn't know who they were. I thought they were just like the guys from around the corner.
Like, I guess, that's kind of the way it is in New York, though, right? The guys around the corner can be those guys, right?
That's true. Yeah.
And so you described like hearing Charlie Parker.
Oh, the first, yeah.
Yeah. As your, intro. I remember hearing Milt Jackson's Goodbye, which was only recorded like in the early 70s, but I remember it vividly as that's the record that kind of brought me in. So can you describe what it was about the Charlie Parker record? What did you start listening to after that, and how did you investigate, getting into bebop?
Well, Stan, the keyboard player in our band, his father had this record collection of all kinds of jazz. And I remember that Charlie Parker song, by the way, it's called She Wrote, R-O-T-E. I remember that was the song that I heard. But he had other records, and then we knew someone who worked at a record store. So we would get free records. And I remember we had records. So we would be in Stan's bedroom and listening to records by Elvin Jones and Sam Rivers. I can't remember a lot of the others, but I remember we had all the blue. We were into blues a lot. We got into blues a lot. So we would have, like I said, Magic Sam. I forget the other Chicago, Buddy Guy.
Oh, nice.
Howlin' Wolf records. And with the other jazz stuff, then I started buying jazz records. I had Charlie Christian record, and then I got a Wes Montgomery record called The Incredible Jazz Guitar of Wes Montgomery. And I think actually that record, I think that Ron Carter plays on that record.
Oh,
wow. I only mention it because Ron's on my latest recording that hasn't come out yet. But yeah.
So do you think
Django Reinhardt? I remember I really went through a Django Reinhardt phase.
So you were open to listening, getting into other genres, because you described yourself at the beginning as, kind of pop, rock, blues.
Yeah.
And do you think, you know, that what what kept you open? Because I don't think not there are some musicians, including myself, who maybe weren't so open to hear. You know, some I feel myself resistant sometimes to like opening up. So
You know what? I don't really, that's hard to say. I think it was just the, finding out that there was all this other music, because when I grew up, we just hear those few songs on the radio and learn them so we could play them at some dance, and then just gradually learning, what, there's all this stuff,
all
what
right,
is.
yeah,
And then, also at that time there was like just a burgeoning jazz and, I mean, rock scene with I can't remember, there was just so many good rock groups back then, it seemed to me. They were getting just better and better. And so I at the same time, I was listening to all that because I could play that. I couldn't play any of the jazz I was listening to at that point. And then I took some lessons from there was a guitarist in Wichita at the university. I studied for a year and a half. This is before I left, of course, but his name was Jerry Hahn. And I studied for a year and a half with him. And he would turn me on to a lot of music, the Miles Davis records and John Coltrane records. But at the same time, our band, we were playing a lot of rock and R&B. We would play James Brown songs, but we would also be playing songs by this group called The Band, who were
oh yeah.
incredible songwriters, like and people like that. I forget some of the other groups we would play with.
So you find yourself in New York City on the Lower East Side, and it sounds like you're kind of chasing music down in the city, and really wherever it is. And so, how do you? What are those? What happens next? How do you get from the guy who's
Well,
standing in the hallway at the Vanguard to you're actually getting a call for a gig, and what kind of gigs were
well,
there, and so on?
I did actually did a few jazz gigs when I first came here. One was on one of those gigs. The drummer Lewis Hayes was
Oh
playing. It
yeah.
was Lewis has a brother, and his brother had hired me. That was my first gig, my first paying gig. But at the same time, then we found an apartment, and we found another apartment, kind of a room within an apartment, and the person who was leasing us that room, he's a saxophone player, and he had a gig with a singer who was popular at the time, Evelyn Champagne King.
Oh yeah.
She's still around, but she was really big then. And so I auditioned for her group. He got me an audition for that, and I got that gig. And so I started traveling with that group. And I
What
made
was
an okay.
what was her hit song?
She had one called Shame.
Oh
She
yeah.
had another song called Love Come Down.
Oh, great
And
song. I love that
yeah,
song.
and there was another
Is this
one.
is this the early '80s at this point? Love Come Down was,
Yeah,
I think, like
uh-huh.
'81.
Yeah, yeah, right through there, 82. Yeah. Yeah, so, and I had that gig, and just kind of like the gig in Rochester where you travel around and play in one city for 5 nights. We really toured. We toured the South and the Midwest and California. And, I mean, we did a lot of traveling on a bus. So there was a lot of, practical, since I didn't go to school that much, I didn't have that kind of training, but I had a lot of on the job training, you know, playing an actual gig and getting paid for it. So I was kind of lucky in that respect.
It
And then from
sounds.
there,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but it just sounds that the type of experience that you're describing is the missing piece for a lot of us musicians. That, you know, we study, we listen, we do our homework, but to get that practical, you know, on the job training is very hard to get, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah, especially now in this period
Right.
where
Yeah.
we have to resort to, you know, playing, doing a Zoom gig with other people, or else, uh, well, there are. I noticed some of the clubs are opening up where the band will actually be playing in the club, although there's not no audience.
All right. Right.
But you
So
know,
you
people can tune in, which I was thinking that might be really lucrative for the clubs, because more they can get more people to tune in. As long as people pay a little something,
hmm
they can get a lot more people, a lot bigger audience than they could in their club.
I remember, I mean, maybe this is around the late 90s or the 2000s, but the Knitting Factory, I think, was the first venue that I ever heard of that was doing like live streaming. And I don't know if it
Oh,
was just
wow.
audio or, but it was a while ago. Maybe I'm wrong. If somebody
Well, they were
knows, you can
definitely
correct
ahead of
me.
the curve then.
I thought so, but I thought it was unique, but like, why would anybody want to, like, you know,
Yeah.
why would anybody want to sit in front of their, you know, receiver at or computer at the time, you know? But I guess you have a point. It might open up, give us some variety and some other options in the future.
Yeah, especially if somebody doesn't want to go out. Well, or you know, like now you can't go out, but what if you don't want to go out? Like
Right.
that
Right.
wasn't. Yeah,
Or if you're home with the kids,
right.
right? So you brought us to Evelyn Champagne King, and here you are,
Okay.
you're touring and you're
Yeah.
gaining this practical knowledge. And take us back there.
Okay, so after Evelyn, then I auditioned for, there's a jazz drummer named Chico Hamilton, and I auditioned for his band. I got in his band. I wasn't in Chico's band very long, but it was sort of this transition to another audition I did was with the saxophone player Stanley Turrentine.
Well, Greg, for a guy that's just coming in to, you know, to New York, you're like hitting your batting average is great.
I, well, I think I was out in the street every night, hang out, and during the daytime, I would go to various people's acquaintances or someone I met. We would get together and play in their
Right.
apartments.
Right.
Do that during the day, and at night I would just hang out at clubs. So that networking really helped, because I
Right.
would meet people. I remember Stanley Turrentine. I heard he was looking for a guitarist, so I went up to, there was a place in Harlem called Small's Paradise,
Yeah.
not to be confused with the club in the Village called Small's, but it's Small. Stanley Turrentine was working at Small's Paradise, so I went up there, and I just it sounds so naive. I went up and I asked who his manager was, and I found out who his manager was, who happened to be in the club, and I told him who I was, and I heard they were looking for a guitarist.
Nothing wrong with that, you know?
No, but yeah, there isn't. I guess I was not quite desperate, but I was sort of hungry. And so his manager told me they were having auditions, like I think in the next couple days, and at this rehearsal studio. So he told me where it was, and when
Greg. Greg.
I auditioned along, I remember there was about 3 or 4 other guitar players, and after the audition, his manager told me, be at Carnegie Hall tomorrow at 3 o'clock for a sound check and wear a tuxedo.
Right.
And so I didn't even really know the repertoire, but I did my first gig at Carnegie Hall.
Oh
I
my
think,
goodness.
yeah, um, standing on stage and not really knowing the material, but I got the gig, and so that led to about 5 years of 5.5 years of traveling. And once again, Stanley at that time, he was very popular. We traveled like all over the world, but a lot of traveling all the time. But at the same time, when we were off, we weren't on what they call retainer, like which some bands have. We were not on retainer, so I I managed to find this. I did this for about a year. I was delivering for a restaurant, a Japanese, a sushi restaurant. I rode a bike and I delivered, you know, food, lunch to, businesses for a restaurant. I was one of the guys that rides around on a bike, that you see. So I did that when we were off, and then I would be, traveling with Stanley for about 5 years, and then I
Craig, we
quit.
could do an entire episode on the side jobs that musicians have had.
Yeah,
Like from restaurant delivery. I worked for a landscaper. I washed
yeah.
dishes in a restaurant.
Oh, you did.
Yeah, well, in the early days, like right after, like my college days,
Right
But
after college, a job washing dishes.
yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah,
You go to college and you start washing dishes.
yeah. When I lived in San Francisco, I think I was 19, and I worked in it was called a Quick Trip. It's kind of like a 7-Eleven, and I got held up.
Oh my goodness. Were you were you behind the cash register?
Yes,
Did you hand over all the money?
yes.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, but at the same time, I was working at night. I was working in a strip club in North Beach, so in a band.
You know, can, tell us more about that because the first time I ever heard about bands playing at strip clubs was from the Hal Blaine's autobiography.
Oh, really?
That's where he got his
I
start.
playing to the Wrecking Crew.
Yeah, yeah. In
So,
Chicago. Go ahead, tell us more about that.
well, um, I might have to edit. There was there was
I'll
a
edit some.
there was a club called the Condor, and I can't remember how I got in that band, but I was in a band. I forget the name of the band now, but
Wait,
we
so
would.
you'd actually play um for the girls dancing, right?
Yeah, we would play their number. Um, they all had a special song. We would play behind them. We would do a set, and there would be about 5 dancers doing. It was like a warm up to the main act. The main act was a woman named Carol Doda, who became. She was actually pretty renowned. She was the first, I think they call them bottomless, topless dancer. So wearing nothing but maybe pasties, I think. Yeah, yeah. All the
Sounds like a tough gig for musicians.
it was it was kind of a strange gig, just coming from Kansas and then moving there, and then all of a sudden you're playing in front of naked women and hanging out with them backstage before you go on.
Did you know what are you thinking at this time? Like, oh my God, I can't wait to start playing jazz, and
Yeah,
I'm only
yeah,
doing this temporarily. What are you thinking?
exactly. Exactly. But at the same time, the band was really good. It was one of those Bay Area kind of funk groups. And it was actually a lot of fun playing those gigs. I mean,
And what are
the,
some of the things you learned? Like, what was it? Just a good muscle builder? Did you play like 6 sets a night? Did you
it was a long night. There were 4 sets a night at that club, but and just, you know, just learning to lock in with the drummer. I remember the drummer was really good.
So take us back now. You're working Chico Hamilton, Stanley Turrentine, and are these like, you know, is Stanley Turrentine touring for 4 or 5 weeks at a time, Europe,
Yeah,
US,
yeah, we would.
like what,
Yeah.
like how long does this last? Elaborate a little more for us on this one.
I was in Stanley's band for 5.5 years. I quit after 5.5 years. I forget why I quit, but I just thought I'd had enough. And I was a little, it just became hard. It was a lot of traveling, being gone all the time. You know, I'd broken up with my girlfriend for different reasons, but that being one of them, just because I was never home. So I wanted to work more around New York. So I did. I would play club dates.
By club dates, can you describe those for the
Oh,
listener?
club dates, right. Club dates, because when I first came to New York, I'd never heard the term club date. I thought club date was playing in a club. A club date on the East Coast is playing either a wedding or bar mitzvah or some kind of, you know, party or industrial event. That's a club date here.
Mm-hmm.
But and I think that's where I met you. If
Yes, we met.
yeah,
I know exactly. We met playing a club date with Robert Pollock,
yeah,
and but so tell us more about club dates. I have very strong opinions about club dates in that I feel like it built my, even though I resisted, I I I wish I can go back and just do them all over again with a better attitude. But
yeah. You know,
but
that that's the that's what I learned. Like it's as good as you it's as good as you want to make it in a way.
absolutely,
You have to, I mean, I remember screwing around on a club date because, you know, people are just eating the fruit cocktail and not listening and you're playing.
yeah,
But if you take it seriously and just play the repertoire as best as you can, it can be really good. But I didn't always do that. But that sort of, in a way, prepared me to play Broadway shows because in a Broadway show, Broadway, you know, Broadway show music isn't my favorite repertoire, but it's the same thing. You're hired to do this, and in good faith that you'll do it as best you can.
yes, indeed.
And yeah, so I learned, um, you know, I became a little more, you know, respectful of just the genre and just I think that's part of becoming a professional.
Yes. There's something about, and not that this conversation is about me, but there's something about playing club dates and having people dance. It's dance music. And
Yeah.
I remember I also had a Mel Bay book. Was it a Mel Bay book? Maybe it was, or I don't remember, but it was a book called The Dance Band Drummer. It was like written by, I think his name was Joel Rothman in the 70s or 60s. And it had like, you know, basic cha-chas and bossa nova and basic swing beat. And I devoured that book when I was like, you know, 12 years old, with like
No kidding.
all these beats. And then years later, I end up playing all those beats on club dates and really to facilitate people's dancing. So there's, you know, just like, I don't know. So do you want to
Don't
tell
you
us a
feel like,
little?
what did you say?
I was just going to ask you if you had, you know, what are some of the other takeaways you learned from club dates, like, you know, as far as your playing and your chops and, you know.
To, well, I think one of the takeaways is to learn, like you just said, cha-cha or whatever it is. For me, to really investigate hey, what does a guitar player play on a cha-cha
Okay.
instead of just screwing around and not playing it right?
Right.
That's what I should have done. I think I eventually did do that, but all those, all those different rhythms, they're valid.
Yes. Yes.
And that's part of, being, a better musician is learning how to do those well.
Uh,
Even though I may think I'm never going to play a cha-cha on the gigs I really want. Actually, who knows? Maybe I will.
That's right. Yeah. There's another aspect about these sort of I don't want to call them transitional gigs, but in my mind, or I think probably many musicians experienced the same thing back in the day, that we thought, oh, we're just doing this gig until the better gigs come around, and
Right.
um
Yeah.
and it's actually I'm not sure if those experiences are available to people coming up in the business. And I'm not just talking about the pandemic. Have you seen, like, what do you see as far as trends for younger players coming up in the
As
business?
as far as, say that
Just,
again.
yeah, what are some opportunities for them that I mean, how do you feel about what where how do they get their start? You got your start by listening to jazz outside of the vanguard. How do they get their start?
Well, I know, I think people still hang out and go to clubs and listen to music. At least here in New York, in the Village, they do. Yeah, people go out and there are jam sessions. They still do that, and I know some really good musicians that play club dates, even though they might
Right.
not advertise it.
At around the time, so we stopped at around Stanley Turrentine. You've just quit his band. You're probably feeling like I could, I want to stay home, but something else will come along. And you had told me once that you worked with the Weather Girls. Was it around this time?
Yeah, it was actually, yeah, it was right after those two gigs actually overlapped a little bit. I remember because I was in Japan with Stanley Turrentine, and I came back, and the same night I arrived, I was working with the Weather Girls. I can't remember where, but I remember I fell asleep right before the gig, just because of the jet lag. But yeah, so I worked with the Weather Girls, an R&B, really good band, good R&B unit. They At that point they weren't. They were just getting ready to split up, and
What was
um,
tell us more about their music, their hit songs, the
they
musical
had a
director,
song
and so on.
called, yeah. What do you say? The musical director?
Musical, yeah.
They had a song called "It's Raining Men," and I think that was their biggest hit. And at the time, the musical director was a keyboard player named David Cole, a really talented guy who went on to become part of a producing duo called C&C Music Factory. This is in, I think, the late 80s.
Mm-hmm. Remember them?
And yeah, C&C Music Factory, that David Cole was part of that. And so I I would record a little bit with them as well. I think I played on some of their hits because of my association with David. And then um, one of the duo, the Weather Girls, they split up, and one of the two members, Martha Wash, um, she pursued her own solo career. So I went on to work with her. Occasionally, I still work with her again.
Am I correct in saying that she has a very identifiable voice that we have probably all heard?
Martha is on some dance hits that are just they're, let me see, iconic. Like everybody dance. I forget what the name of the
Is
song
that
is.
her? Yeah.
Everybody dance now.
Yeah.
In fact,
Yeah.
that one, and there was a couple other ones. Martha was the
She
voice.
does. She does. I Got the Power, right?
Right, she does that. Um, there was another. I forget the name of her other hits, but I've heard them on, you know, they get used for commercials. But at the time when she recorded those hits were actually there was another singer who was it was Martha's voice, but another singer was being used for the visual.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. So she wasn't in any videos, right?
No, because probably because of her size, she's a big lady, so they got a real cute little smaller woman to sing on in the videos and to front the group live, but it was actually Martha singing.
Sounds like fodder for a lawsuit in today's climate.
Well, I think, yeah, I think she did. Yeah, I think she did win that one too.
um, so so far, I mean, this is like when we started out, I said you've had a rich and varied, career, and now you're actually laying it out for us because you're going from shows to actual clubs to strip clubs to weddings and some jazz and R&B. So two big pieces that I think would be very interesting for our audience would be, your Broadway experience, and also your your projects as as a recording artist and what you're doing. So why don't we hit the Broadway stuff first?
Okay, so the Broadway stuff, I remember I think I started playing Broadway about 98, about 22 years ago. And what happened was I just was not in that clique. It's sort of I think more so back then it was more of a clique that was harder to get into, whereas now I think to get into Broadway, if I knew then what I knew now, or the way how musicians approach it now is just to call up the person who holds a chair of the instrument that you play and ask if they need someone to sub for them.
Mm-hmm.
But back then I remember I didn't have any hooks into the Broadway scene, but I knew one guy who did a.
We lost Greg right there. Greg,
And I
come
remember
back.
once he said, "Man, I wish I could have you come in, but I just don't. I know I owe guys favors, and I've got my guys." I said, "Oh, that's okay, you know." But what happened? He needed someone. His show was closing, and he had some dates he had to fill. He couldn't make, and he couldn't. None of his subs could make any of those dates, and since the show was closing, it was hard for him to get anyone to learn the show because to learn somebody's show, it's kind of a lot of work, and you don't want to do that unless if you're only getting one or two,
Right.
shows out of it. But that's what he was offering me, and I took it. So I learned his show,
What was
and
the show, Greg?
it was called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor
Oh
Dreamcoat.
yeah. Yeah.
It's an Andrew Lloyd Webber show. So I played those two shows, and that show closed. And that was that for a while until the other guitar player that played that show asked me to fill in for him on the road for a couple weeks. So I did that. And then from that, then I could call people and say, hey, I've done this. And I think that's what I did. I spoke to a couple people and said that I had done that. So I had a little bit of Broadway experience, and so I subbed on a couple other shows, and then I went out on the road. I was offered a road tour of, I think it was right when my daughter was born. I didn't want to go out on the road, so I was offered this a 6-month run of the show Rent, the Broadway show Rent,
Mm-hmm.
on the road, and I turned it down. And then I remember the next day I found out my wife was pregnant, so I called the person back, and asked them if the gig was still available.
We're gonna need some money.
Yeah. So yeah, that was, so I started doing a lot of show work. At the same time, when I would be back in town, I would be playing jazz gigs. And I always kind of did, jazz gigs here in town and a little bit of traveling all through all this, all the other, you know, kind of work and career. But then I took that 6 month run of doing Rent. And while I was out on the road doing Rent, I would take my guitar and go sit in at jazz clubs.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those clubs, like in St. Paul and Denver, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Denver, I would wind up being able to book my own gigs there later, just because I went and acquainted myself with the musicians and the people who ran the clubs. But so I started doing the Broadway stuff, and then there was a point in 2003 where there was a new show called Wicked, and they were doing what they call a reading of a couple of the songs, where they just test out how the orchestration sounds. And so I got called to do this reading, not knowing anything. It probably paid $150, and then that was it. But then the show, when they decided to open the show in New York, I got called for that. So
Another example of how you like hit another home run. you know, you know, because like, you know, Broadway is all about how, it's how long the show is going to run, and here you are with Wicked, right?
yeah, I know. I'd had most of the shows run. I heard that the time average life of a Broadway show is 6 months or less. And a lot of them, a lot of people that are on the Broadway scene, they go from show to show like that, because they don't last very long. But so I got this. It actually wasn't my first show. I did another show before that, shortly before that, but it only ran about 6 weeks in
Oh wow.
preview. So that was another one of those Broadway fatalities. But yeah, I definitely hit a home run with Wicked.
So how do you get the? Is it as simple as you do a great job during the reading, and then 4 months later, when they start rehearsing the band, they're like, "Hey, let's get that guy again." I mean, or do you have to kind of convince the contractor that you're worthy? How does this actually happen?
The I think the protocol is that if you get called for the reading, and you I think you automatically get called. You're supposed to. I mean, all kinds of rules are probably broken about that, but basically the protocol is that if you do the reading, and that's sort of like your audition,
Right.
and you don't screw up too bad, then you get called. You're automatically, they're obligated to call you for the show.
You may get this question a lot, but what's it like to play 8 shows a week? And
You know, at this point, I might not be the typical person to ask that, because I do get that question a lot from all kinds of people, my friends that play jazz, and they say, how can you do that? That must be hard. But I think, and for me, it's not that hard. It's difficult. You have to really pay attention, but I'm so grateful to have the gig that it's not hard. I don't know if that really explains it, but
no,
it makes
Absolutely. And I guess I would ask a follow-up question. Is there a certain mindset you need to, to deliver the same level of performance, night after night?
I think it's that mindset that started during those club date days.
Okay.
When you're doing something that you think is inconsequential, that after these people's wedding, that they're not even listening to the band,
Right.
and so you think, oh, I'm just going to start screwing around. But if you take it seriously, people notice. People
Right.
notice all that stuff. But I think that's the mindset that I developed from realizing that on club dates. That I mean, on Broadway, it's you they demand a certain amount of just you have to really be on your game.
Yes, indeed. And I guess it's one of the few full-time jobs musicians can expect these days, right?
Yeah, or playing. Well, there's some touring groups, I guess, with you know, I don't know. I guess you could be touring with someone that tours a lot.
Okay.
The pop artists that really do tour still, or you could have a the house band on a TV show.
Well,
Like,
there you go. Yeah.
yeah, that's another one. But yeah, the Broadway scene, and I don't think the Broadway scene was always like that, because I've heard that at one point, I mean, at least in New York, that it was like, I don't want to do that, because there was a lot more jingle work, the studio
Hmm.
work, and that's what everybody wanted to do. No one really, the better players didn't necessarily do Broadway, but I think now a lot of really good players very well do Broadway.
Right. It's like a changing the goals, or the target always changes as to what musicians will aspire to as far as work, right? Because
Yeah,
through
you've
through the
when was your first Broadway experience?
my very first one was Rent, and that's where you and I subbed on Rent, on Broadway
Right.
together too. So that was my very first one, and I actually I met Jeff Potter through I had known Kenny Russia, and that when they
Because
were
Kenny Brescia had worked in the Club Date band that you and I met.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
exactly, yep. And yeah, just so for anybody listening, just to show you how networking works in New York. I mean, at least how it worked for us. That I bumped into Kenny at a recording studio when they were recording the Cast album, and I was making a record with They Might Be Giants, and
Hmm.
we literally met like in the lounge, pouring coffee, and then he introduced me to Jeff Potter, and I had no idea what the show was about,
Oh,
or
no
if it.
kidding. That okay.
And yeah, I know. I had seen. You remember the days when like they were heavily advertising that show on the roof of yellow taxis in New
Yeah.
York City. Remember that?
But also you were pretty ensconced in the rock scene then.
Yes, yes, but yeah, and I had no idea. And then it was like 2 years later that Jeff actually called me to sub on the show. So I kind of did the same thing that you did. But I just remember thinking, if I'm going to learn this show, there's no way I'm gonna make any errors.
Right.
I remember just really shedding it to the point where it's like I lived the music, and then when I walked in, I didn't want to disappoint anybody.
The subs are actually held on a lot closer under the mirror than the regulars are.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, very very difficult to be a sub on Broadway if you
Yeah.
you know. Um, I think at about this point in the convo, take us to. So I'm thinking of Ron Carter. You brought up Ron Carter, and this would be a good way to get us into your solo stuff. And And
Okay,
I'm thinking
so
of Ron Carter because he's the doesn't he play bass on So What and kind of Blue?
let me see. Is he on So What? I think that might be actually Paul Chambers.
Oh
No, that's
yeah.
Paul. Yeah, that's Paul Chambers.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, but Ron took over the bass chair in Miles Davis's group.
Okay.
He was the next bass player after Paul Chambers, and I think Paul Chambers is one of Ron's. Ron used really looked up to him. They're both from Detroit. Ron followed Paul in Miles's group. Ron wound up playing the line on the bass line that Paul Chambers plays on So What.
Right.
Ron wound up playing that so many times with Miles. But yeah, so
So what do you do when you're recording your own stuff and you're looking over at Ron Carter and do you ever just have a moment where you're like, this guy has so much history? Like,
well,
you know,
I had a while to get used to it because I played in Ron's. Ron has a big band. Ron has different configurations of his group. Ron still plays a lot around town
okay.
and on tour. He has a trio with guitar, piano, and bass. He has a quartet with saxophone, piano, bass, and drums. He has a nonet, and he has a big band. And I was I got called to sub in his big band, and which it was a little. I've probably done that. He does the big band probably just once a year, but for a week at one of the clubs here in New York. So I got called to sub on the big band, and uh, it was a little kind of unsettling to go in and because in the big band the guitar player's sitting right next to Ron,
Uh-huh.
and he's scrutinizing what I'm doing. In fact, at the first rehearsal I did with his big band, the first song, and I think I knew maybe one or two people in the big band, so I wasn't really acquainted with most of them, and I was a sub. It's my first rehearsal. So we did about 8 bars into the first song we're rehearsing, and Ron stops and goes, hold it, everybody. Greg, what are you playing on?"
Spotlight.
And exactly. I was like, oh, where can I just disappear right now?
At that point, you realize your music was upside down.
I wish. But anyway, yeah, there was something I was doing that he didn't like, and
That's so funny because it's
but
it's also typical of right how I mean that happens to us a lot. I mean,
oh yeah,
to musicians,
and
like
Ron,
you know.
yeah, and he's not thinking like I'm gonna embarrass this guy. He's just thinking, I know Ron Carter. I know how he thinks. He was a side man on so many record dates. When he does his own gigs, he wants things right.
All
You
right.
know, he's not going to speak up at a recording date, but yeah, I know how that was where that came from. It wasn't from trying to embarrass the guitar player, but he didn't realize, how somebody like how unsettling that could be to someone. But yeah, so I managed to play in his big band for about 5 different years. Only 1 week a year, but still I kept getting called, so that's a good sign. And then I just thought, you know what, I want to do a record with this guy, and he's not going to call me. So I just kind of had this concept for a record with with you know masters, older guys.
Right.
So I called Ron. I was very careful before I thought a lot about it. A lot of thought went into it about how I was going to pitch it to him, because I knew I couldn't pay him the way he's used to getting paid.
Right.
But I just made sure everything was, the pitch was right. And when we went, he agreed to do it because he knew me. And so I made sure I had to make sure all my music was really correct and, easy to read. I had it all planned out, the recording. So by that time, it was still a little unsettling playing with him. Just
And are you
mainly,
recording your original song tunes, or
I did two of only. I usually do a lot more of my original music on my recordings, but I only did two of them on this recording because I kind of wanted to do more standards. But we
Mhm.
did do two of my songs, and we did two of Ron's, and then the rest of the songs are sort of old pop standards or jazz standards.
How many how many albums have you put out?
Um, Five so far, and this will be my sixth when it comes out.
And about what's the ratio of covers to original content? 50-50, or over the five albums?
I think most of those. There's one record where I think it's all my
Oh,
songs.
nice.
Usually, it's about uh, eight originals and two covers. And this record, it's the opposite. That's flipped. It's like two originals and eight covers.
Nice. Greg, how can we find your work?
Oh,
How can listeners get in touch with you?
I
Um,
can. I have a website, um, gregscaff.com. One G on the end of my first name, GregSkaff.com. I'm on
okay.
Facebook. You can email me. I'm down for lessons or, Skype or whatever.
Okay. Do you feel comfortable with your giving out? Do, do we get in touch with you on your webpage, or do you want to give out your email address?
Oh, email address. Yeah. gregscaff@gmail.com.
Okay.
GregSkaff.
Okay. And is your music available on all streaming platforms?
I'm pretty sure. I know it's on Spotify, Apple Music. Um, yeah, pretty sure it is.
And what's the name of your new record that's going to be coming out, and when it's going to be released?
I haven't decided that my latest one that's already out is called Soulmation. But I haven't really decided on the title of this newest one yet. I thought about calling it um, In Full Swing, but I'm not sure about that. And then I thought about calling it um, I can't remember. Um, Actually, the one that's out now, my latest one, it actually came out a couple of years ago. It's called Soulmation. It's kind of more. It's not really traditional jazz. It's loud guitars, which I like. So,
What's not to like about it?
hey,
Um, Greg, I really enjoyed our conversation, and your
I just
career is
one.
fascinating.
Can I tell one more little
Absolutely.
thing?
Go ahead.
As far as I just said, I like loud guitars. The first time I met Ron Carter, we were talking about, I forget, we were talking about something. Something came up about a guitar, and it was, distorted or like it was overdriven guitar. And I remember Ron saying, I don't understand why someone would want to distort a guitar. And I, and I felt like saying, I had just met him, but I felt like saying, because it sounds good.
That's hilarious. Well, thank you so much. What a great conversation.
My
And
pleasure, man. I'm really good. Thanks for asking me. And good talking to you. I really enjoyed it.
yeah, and thank you. And your career is very, very interesting, and your story is compelling. And so I want to thank you. And that about wraps it up for today.
Thanks, Bri.
So Greg, I'm gonna stop recording, and then